You faced your pain. You did the hard work. You stopped chasing validation, stopped wearing masks, stopped performing for love. You looked directly at the parts of yourself you'd been running from your entire life. And now, you're left with silence. No drive. No excitement, no urgency to build the new you, just stillness. And somewhere in your mind, a small voice whispers, "What's wrong with me? The truth? Nothing. You're not broken. You're not lazy. You're not falling apart. You're in the most sacred part of transformation, the one no one talks about." Most people imagine healing as a triumphant climb. Hard work followed by clarity, purpose, and peace. A before and after photo where the after is someone glowing with newfound motivation and direction. But Carl Jung knew better. He knew that once the mask drops and the shadow is integrated, the old engine that used to drive your life disappears too. The fear-driven ambition, the validation-seeking success, the people-pleasing productivity, the overachievement born from a deep terror of not being enough, gone. And what replaces it? Silence, emptiness, strange, unsettling confusion. You're no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming. This isn't failure. This is what Jung called the transcendent function. The psychological process that bridges the gap between conscious and unconscious, between who you thought you were and who you actually are. This is the void, and it's not here to destroy you. It's here to realign you. Pause here and take a breath. Have you been carrying the weight of thinking something is wrong with you for feeling this way? Before shadow work, your motivation was alive, electric, urgent. It vibrated through every cell of your body, pulling you forward with an intensity that felt like life itself. You worked hard because you were afraid of being abandoned, rejected, unseen. You pushed yourself because somewhere deep down, you were running from a version of yourself that felt fundamentally unlovable. You achieved because achieving meant you mattered. You performed because performing meant you were worthy of attention, care, love. Maybe you were the achiever, collecting accomplishments like armor against the world's judgment. Your identity was built on being the smart one, the successful one, the one who never failed. Every goal reached was proof that you deserved to take up space in the world. Maybe you were the helper, giving until you disappeared into the needs of others. Your worth was measured by how indispensable you could become, how much you could sacrifice, how completely you could anticipate and meet everyone else's needs while ignoring your own. Maybe you were the rebel, fighting everything to avoid fighting yourself. Your identity was built on being different, on rejecting what others valued, on proving that you couldn't be controlled or diminished. But underneath the rebellion was still the same wound, the fear of not being enough as you naturally are. Maybe you were the perfectionist, believing that if you could just get everything right, do everything flawlessly, control every outcome, then you would finally be safe from criticism, rejection, or abandonment. Your motivation came from the terror of making mistakes, of being seen as human. These patterns felt like motivation. They moved you through the world with purpose and intensity. They gave your days structure and your life direction. But they weren't coming from your authentic self. They were coming from your wounded self, desperately trying to avoid more pain. Jung called these patterns persona, the mask we wear to interface with the world, the false self we construct to meet society's expectations and avoid society's rejection. The persona isn't entirely bad. We all need ways to navigate social situations and professional environments. But when the persona becomes our entire identity, When we lose touch with who we are underneath the mask, we become motivated by external validation rather than internal truth. But once you started healing, that fuel runs out. Once you begin to see these patterns clearly, once you understand how they developed and why they served you, once you start to separate your true self from your survival strategies, the old motivations simply evaporate. And now, you're not lazy, you're just done pretending. You're not unmotivated. You just can't go back to what never truly mattered. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you now know about yourself. You can't go back to being motivated by fear once you've tasted what it feels like to be motivated by truth. Let me tell you about Sarah. She spent her 20s climbing the corporate ladder with the intensity of someone running from a fire. 70-hour weeks, checking her phone at 2 a.m., being the first one in the office and the last one to leave. She told herself she was ambitious, driven, destined for success. But when she started therapy, really started looking at why she couldn't sit still, why she needed to be indispensable, why the thought of someone being disappointed in her felt like actual death. She discovered something that changed everything. She discovered her shadow, the terrified little girl who learned that love was conditional on performance, who learned that her worth was measured by how much she could give, achieve, produce, who learned that being enough meant being everything to everyone except herself. This little girl had been running Sarah's entire life from the unconscious. Every promotion sought, every extra hour worked, every sacrifice made was actually this wounded child desperately trying to prove that she deserved love, attention, care. 6 months into real healing work, Sarah couldn't get out of bed to check her emails. Not because she was depressed, but because the old motivations had simply evaporated. The fear that used to drive her had been seen, understood, and integrated. The wounded child had been acknowledged and comforted. The survival strategies had been recognized as just that. Strategies, not identity. She'd call me, confused and a little panicked. I used to care so much about everything. Now, I look at my goals list and feel nothing. Like I'm looking at someone else's life. Like these dreams belong to a person I used to be, but can't remember how to become again. That's the thing about shadow work. You don't just integrate the dark parts of yourself, the anger, the jealousy, the selfishness, the parts you've been taught to be ashamed of. You also have to say goodbye to the false parts, the parts that were never really you, but were born from wounds, fears, and unconscious patterns that kept you safe but not necessarily authentic. Jung called this process individuation, becoming who you actually are, rather than who you think you should be. But he also warned that it involves a kind of death. The death of the persona, the mask, the false self that's been running the show for so long that you've forgotten there's anyone else underneath. This death feels like loss, because it is loss. You're losing the familiar structures that gave your life meaning, even if that meaning was built on shaky ground. You're losing the identity that others recognized and validated, even if that identity wasn't truly you. You're losing the motivations that moved you through the world, even if those motivations were rooted in fear rather than love. So what do you do when nothing moves you anymore? What do you do when the old dreams feel empty and the new ones haven't arrived yet? What do you do when everyone around you is hustling and grinding and building and achieving, and you can barely remember why any of it matters? What do you do when people ask about your 5-year plan, and you can't even imagine what you want for lunch? What do you do when the very idea of productivity makes you feel nauseous? When optimization sounds like a foreign language? When goal setting feels like putting on clothes that belong to someone else? If this part hits something in you, keep going. The next few minutes might feel like a mirror. They might also feel like medicine. The answer isn't to force the old motivations back to life. They've served their purpose. They brought you to this moment of awakening, this opportunity for authentic transformation. Trying to resurrect them would be like trying to fit back into clothes you wore in childhood. Not just uncomfortable, but impossible. The answer lies in understanding what's actually happening in this void, why it's necessary, and how to navigate it with grace rather than resistance. Here's the truth. No one tells you about post-shadow work life, the secret that therapy doesn't prepare you for, and self-help books conveniently skip over. The emptiness isn't a problem to solve. It's a space to inhabit. The void isn't a mistake in your healing process. It's the most important part. First, allow the silence. Without guilt, rest is not laziness. Stillness is not stagnation. You're not stuck. You're regenerating at levels so deep that consciousness can't perceive the work being done. Think of it this way. You've been living your entire life in a house that wasn't really yours. You inherited it from your family, your culture, your wounds. You decorated it according to what you thought others wanted to see. You arranged the furniture to hide the cracks in the foundation. You kept all the lights on constantly, so no one, including yourself, could see the shadows hiding in the corners. For years, maybe decades, you maintained this house. You worked tirelessly to make it presentable, impressive, worthy of admiration. You invited people over and watched their faces for signs of approval or judgment. You measured your worth by how well you could maintain the facade. Shadow work was finally turning on the lights in every room and seeing everything clearly. The beauty and the damage, the authentic pieces and the borrowed ones, the parts that were truly you and the parts that were inherited trauma masquerading as personality. But now you have to decide how you actually want to live, what you actually want in your space, what feels true to who you are underneath all the performance, not who you've been performing to be. And that decision takes time. It takes stillness. It takes a willingness to sit in the unknown while you figure out what authentic living actually looks like for you. Jung wrote extensively about this in his concept of holding the tension of opposites. You're between identities right now, between the old motivation and the new, between who you were and who you're becoming, between the life you built and the life that wants to emerge. This tension feels uncomfortable because we're taught that growth should be linear, that healing should be immediately productive, that every day should move us measurably forward towards some predetermined goal. But psychological transformation doesn't work that way. It's not linear. It's not predictable. It's not productive in any way that capitalism can measure or monetize. It's more like a chrysalis. And here's what most people don't understand about metamorphosis. The caterpillar doesn't just grow wings and become a butterfly. It literally dissolves into primordial soup. Its entire structure breaks down into an undifferentiated mass of potential before reorganizing into something entirely new. You're in the soup right now, and that's exactly where you need to be. The cells that were caterpillar cells are dying off. The cells that will become butterfly cells haven't fully formed yet. There's this space in between where you're neither one thing nor another, just pure potential waiting to take shape. If you could observe a chrysalis during this phase, it would look like nothing was happening. From the outside, it's just a still, quiet shell. But inside, the most incredible transformation in nature is taking place. That's what's happening to you. The stillness isn't emptiness. It's reorganization. The quiet isn't absence. It's preparation. The void isn't nothing. It's everything waiting to be born. Second, listen for the whisper, not the roar. The old motivation was loud. It screamed at you to move, to achieve, to prove, to perform. It came from fear and urgency and the desperate need to outrun your own insecurities before they caught up and consumed you. It was the motivation of emergency, of survival, of a nervous system that believed it was always under threat and had to constantly produce evidence of its worthiness to exist. But motivation that comes from truth, it whispers. It doesn't demand. It suggests. It doesn't push. It invites. It doesn't scream from the wounded parts of your psyche. It murmurs from the authentic parts of your soul. Your job right now is to stay quiet enough to hear it. This is what Jung meant by listening to the unconscious, not the chaotic, neurotic voice of unhealed wounds demanding constant action to avoid pain, but the deeper wisdom that emerges when you stop forcing and start allowing. This deeper voice speaks differently. It doesn't use the language of fear, urgency, or comparison. It uses the language of curiosity, resonance, and authentic desire. Maybe it's a gentle curiosity about something you haven't thought about in years, a slow pull toward learning about astronomy, or trying watercolor painting, or volunteering at an animal shelter. Not because it will advance your career or impress anyone, but because something in you responds to it with inexplicable warmth. Maybe it's a quiet desire to create something just for the joy of creating. To write not for publication, but for expression. To cook not for efficiency, but for the meditative rhythm of chopping vegetables. To garden not for the harvest, but for the daily communion with growth and seasons. Maybe it's an impulse to reach out to someone you haven't spoken to in years. Not because you need something from them, but because they've been appearing in your thoughts with gentle persistence, or to take a different route home from work. Because something about a particular street calls to you in a way you can't explain. These aren't the burning ambitions of your 20s. They're not the 5-year plans and vision boards and massive action steps that the productivity culture taught you to value. They're the quiet callings of your authentic self, the soft invitations from the part of you that exists, beyond fear, beyond performance, beyond the need to prove anything to anyone. This voice is always there, but when we're caught up in the noise of fear-based motivation, we can't hear it. It gets drowned out by the urgent demands of the survival self, the part of us that believes it has to constantly achieve, produce, and perform to be worthy of love and belonging. But now that the noise has died down, now that the false motivations have dissolved, this quieter voice has space to emerge. And learning to hear it, trust it, and follow it is the key to developing authentic motivation. Third, redefine progress as presence. Here's what the productivity culture won't tell you, what the hustle mentality can't comprehend, what the achievement-oriented society refuses to acknowledge. You don't need to produce to matter. You don't need to chase to be valuable. You don't need to constantly become to be worthy of love. You are allowed to be, right now, as you are, in this very moment, and still be becoming. Progress isn't just about doing more, achieving more, accumulating more. Sometimes progress is about being more real, more honest, more aligned with your actual values instead of inherited expectations, more connected to your authentic desires instead of prescribed goals. Sometimes progress looks like doing less but with more intention, creating less but with more soul, achieving less but impacting more deeply. Let me tell you about Marcus. He was a marketing consultant who had built his entire business on networking, aggressive client acquisition, and what he called strategic relationship building. His calendar was packed with coffee meetings, industry events, and follow-up calls. He measured his success by how many connections he could make, how many opportunities he could create, how visible he could be in his industry. After his shadow, work, which revealed how much of his professional identity was built on a deep fear of being forgotten or overlooked. He couldn't bring himself to network anymore. The thought of another strategic coffee meeting made him feel physically ill. He couldn't promote his business with the same aggressive energy. He couldn't hustle for clients the way he used to. For months, he thought he was failing. His income dropped, his visibility decreased. Other consultants in his field seemed to be racing past him while he sat in what felt like professional quicksand. But something interesting happened during this period of supposed decline. The clients who did find him were different. They weren't attracted to his marketing strategy or his network or his industry reputation. They were attracted to his authenticity, his depth, his refusal to sell them dreams he didn't believe in. His business became smaller but more meaningful. His days became slower but more fulfilling. His relationships became fewer but more genuine. He stopped asking, "How can I get ahead?" and started asking, "How can I be real?" That shift changed everything. The old Marcus had been motivated by the fear of being irrelevant. The new Marcus was motivated by the desire to be useful in ways that aligned with his values. The old Marcus worked to be seen. The new Marcus worked to be helpful. The external metrics might have suggested he was less successful, but the internal experience told a completely different story. He was finally doing work that mattered to him, with people who valued what he actually had to offer in ways that honored both his humanity and his expertise. You don't need to feel driven. You need to feel aligned. Take a moment here. What would it mean to stop measuring yourself by productivity metrics and start measuring yourself by authenticity metrics? What would change if your definition of success had more to do with how real you could be than how much you could achieve? This is the shift that happens in the void. When the old motivations dissolve, they create space for new definitions of progress, success, and worthiness to emerge. Definitions that come from your authentic self, rather than your wounded self. Definitions that honor your humanity, rather than demanding you transcend it. Fourth, understand the sacred timing of emergence. There's something else Jung understood about transformation that most people miss. It has its own timing. It can't be rushed, forced, or optimized. It unfolds according to laws that are deeper than conscious will, more mysterious than strategic planning. You can't make a seed grow faster by pulling on the sprout. You can't force a flower to bloom by prying open the petals. You can't rush the seasons or demand that winter immediately becomes spring. Psychological transformation follows the same natural rhythms. There's a time for breaking down and a time for building up. A time for letting go and a time for reaching toward. A time for silence and a time for speaking. Right now, you're in the time for silence. The time for letting the old structures completely dissolve before new ones begin to form. The time for trusting that something is happening even when you can't see evidence of it. This isn't passive waiting. This is active presence, active listening, active allowance of whatever needs to emerge in its own time and its own way. The void isn't empty. It's pregnant with possibility, and like any pregnancy, it has its own gestation period that can't be hurried without risking the health of what's being born. Your authentic motivation is in there. Developing.organizing, preparing to emerge. But it needs time to fully form. It needs the safety of your patience, the nourishment of your acceptance, the protection of your trust in the process. Slowly, quietly, you'll start to feel small sparks, not the urgent fire of old ambitions, but gentle interests, a curiosity about something you haven't explored in years, a desire to create again, but from your own truth this time, not from the need to impress or achieve. You might find yourself drawn to things that don't make sense to the old you. Maybe you want to garden instead of network. Maybe you want to write poetry instead of business plans. Maybe you want to volunteer with animals instead of climbing corporate ladders. The people around you might not understand. They might ask when you're going to get back to normal, when you're going to get your motivation back. But you'll know something they don't. You're not getting anything back. You're moving forward, just not in the way that looks like progress to a world addicted to external achievement. This is what Jung called the return. But it's not a return to who you were. It's a return to who you've always been, underneath all the conditioning, all the performing, all the fear-driven striving. You'll start asking different questions. Instead of, what should I do? You'll ask, what feels true? Instead of, how can I succeed? You'll ask, how can I contribute? Instead of, what do they want from me? You'll ask, what does my soul want to express? These questions lead to different answers, quieter answers, deeper answers. You might discover that what you really want is simpler than you thought, more relational than transactional, more creative than competitive, more connected than individual. When these impulses come, and they will come, don't rush them. Don't turn them into another productivity system. Don't make them perform. Follow them slowly. Trust them. Let them grow on their own terms, not society's terms. A gentle journaling prompt for you. What small thing are you curious about right now? Not what you think you should be curious about, but what actually draws your attention when you're not trying to be productive. The path back to authentic motivation isn't through forcing or pushing. It's through following the threads of genuine interest, one small step at a time. True motivation, the kind that comes from your authentic self rather than your wounded self, the kind that honors your humanity rather than demanding you transcend it, the kind that serves your soul rather than just your ego, is not about getting more done. It's about becoming more real, and once you've faced your shadow, once you've integrated the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject, once you've said goodbye to the false motivations that were never really yours to begin with, you no longer have space for fake ambition. You want meaning. You want depth. You want to move because something inside you wants to speak. Not because something outside you demands performance. This new motivation feels radically different. It's steadier but quieter, less urgent but more sustainable. It comes from love rather than fear, from authenticity rather than image management. You might find yourself working less but creating more meaningfully, achieving less by external metrics but contributing more by your values, impressing fewer people but touching them more deeply. You might discover that what you wanted all along wasn't success as society defines it. It was significance as your soul understands it. Not recognition from everyone, but resonance with the right people. Not to be seen as perfect, but to be loved as real. This motivation is sustainable because it's authentic. It doesn't require constant validation or depend on comparison with others. It comes from inherent worth rather than earned worthiness. So if you're feeling unmotivated right now, honor that. Don't fight it. Don't force it. Don't try to resurrect the old motivations that were never really yours to begin with. Sit with the emptiness. Trust the void. Allow the silence to do its work. And ask yourself gently, what part of me is ready to live now that the performance is over? What wants to emerge now that the false self has stepped aside? What does my authentic self actually want to create, experience, or contribute to the world? Because motivation isn't missing. It's just waiting for you to stop looking for it in who you used to be and start finding it in who you're becoming. It's waiting for you to stop trying to force it from the outside and start allowing it to emerge from the inside. It's waiting for you to remember that the most powerful motivation comes not from what you lack, but from what you love. Not from what you fear, but from what feels true. Not from who you think you should be, but from who you actually are when all the masks come off. One final reflection question. If you could only pursue things that genuinely matter to you, not to your family, not to society, not to your old wounded self, but to the person you're becoming, the authentic self that's been waiting patiently underneath all the performance, what would you choose? Don't answer immediately. Sit with the question. Let it settle into your bones. Let it whisper to the parts of you that have been quiet for so long. The answer might surprise you. It might be simpler than you expected, or more creative, or more relational, or more focused on being than doing. It might not look like success as you've been taught to define it, but it might just be the beginning of everything. The first thread of authentic motivation that, when followed with patience and trust, leads you home to yourself. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your own experience with motivation after shadow work. Sometimes the most healing thing is knowing we're not alone in these quiet transformations. Share your story in the comments, not for the algorithm, but for the humans who need to hear that their emptiness isn't failure. It's fertile ground. And if you found this helpful, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear that they're not broken. They're not lazy. They're not lost. They're just in the sacred space between who they were and who they're becoming. Sometimes that's the most generous gift we can offer. The permission to be exactly where they are without having to fix it, rush it, or apologize for it. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for honoring your process, for trusting the void, for having the courage to face your shadow and the patience to wait for what emerges on the other side. Thank you for being willing to question everything you've been taught about motivation, success, and worthiness. Thank you for being brave enough to let the false parts of yourself die so that the true parts can finally live. Your authentic motivation is not lost. It's not broken. It's not missing. It's just getting ready to be born.